Hello and welcome back to Lingering Light. Did you know that you could spend 50 years digging in the dirt for gold only to realize that the greatest treasure was hidden under your own ribs all along? If you ignore this truth, you risk ending your journey like an exhausted hunter with empty pockets, realizing too late that the fortune you sought from strangers was already in your hands since the day you were born. Many of us are caught in the trap of the distant horizon, believing that happiness is a destination we can only reach after a long and arduous journey, while our souls remain covered in the dust of daily worries and busy identities. Today, through the piercing wisdom of the Persian poet Hafez and the story of an 84-year-old traveler named Arthur, you will discover the map to your own heart. Hafez, born around 1315 in the beautiful city of Shiraz, Persia. Known as the tongue of the hidden and the interpreter of secrets, he spent his life as a seeker of the divine. His masterpiece, the Divan-i Hafez, is still used today as an oracle by millions seeking guidance. Hafez teaches us that God is not a distant judge, but a beloved friend who is constantly trying to surprise us with joy. One of his most enduring lessons is about the treasure in the jar, the idea that we spend our lives searching the world for a fortune that has been tucked away in our own hearts since the day we were born. Arthur is 84, a retired archaeologist who spent 50 years digging in the dirt of Egypt, Greece, and Peru. He has dedicated his life to searching for the big find. Now, living in a quiet cottage in Maine, Arthur feels that his days of digging are behind him. He gazes at his dusty shelves and senses that the treasure hunt of his life has concluded in a tranquil room of silence. Right then, he made a silent, sacred vow to stop digging in the cold dirt of the past and finally start excavating the rich, golden jar of the present. Arthur had spent his entire life living strictly by the map, always convinced that the next grand discovery would be the one to finally complete him. He was a man defined by the next expedition, a perpetual seeker who believed that the truth was always buried somewhere else, perhaps under layers of desert sand or hidden in the humid depths of a remote jungle. For 5 long decades, his eyes were constantly fixed on that shimmering, distant horizon, forever searching for a glimmer of gold or the unmistakable silhouette of a forgotten city. He had lived under the heavy illusion that happiness was a final destination, a place you reach only after crossing enough borders, surviving enough storms, and enduring enough hardships. But as the years went by, the physical reality of time began to settle into his bones. His once nimble knees grew stiff and painful, making even a walk to the porch feel like a grueling desert crossing. His passport, once vibrant with the colorful ink of every continent, began to gather dust on a shelf, its empty pages a reminder of a world that was moving on without him. In the quiet of his Maine cottage, Arthur felt a creeping, cold sense of failure. He began to carefully wipe the dust of shoulds and musts off his tired spirit, revealing a glowing, golden contentment that had been sitting there all along, patiently waiting for him to stop being so incredibly busy. It was a revelation that struck him with the force of a falling temple stone. He realized with a stinging clarity that he had spent 80 years as an expert of the external. He had dedicated his best years to meticulously studying the broken pots and discarded fragments that others had left behind, yet he had never once bothered to peek inside the vessel of his own being. His constant, frantic searching had been a clever way of running away from the profound stillness of his own soul. He saw now that his thirst for adventure was actually a deep, spiritual thirst for the beloved, which he had been trying to satisfy with the bitter salt water of worldly travel. He began to intentionally practice what he called the sobriety of joy. He discovered that when he finally stopped analyzing his life like a specimen under a microscope and started truly appreciating it, he felt a lightness of spirit that he had not known since he was a 6-year-old child. He began to see that his 84 years were not a heavy burden to carry, but were instead a rare and precious vintage, slowly maturing and gaining depth in the cellar of time. He understood that the map he truly needed was not one of geography, but one of the heart. For the longest time, Hafez has spoken eloquently about the beloved hiding in the most surprisingly ordinary places, such as in the simple steam rising from a cup of wine, the gentle breath of a morning wind, or even the fleeting curve of a simple smile from a passing neighbor. He suggests with great poetic depth that the ultimate treasure is never truly lost, but is instead merely covered in the thick, gray dust of our daily worries, our frantic schedules, and our loud, busy identities. For a man like Arthur, the ordinary had always been synonymous with the boring and the irrelevant. Throughout his career, he had craved only the spectacular and the monumental, seeking out sacred gold and ancient stone temples that stood as testaments to greatness. In his current life, he looked at his daily routine, the mechanical act of making toast, the ritual of checking the empty mailbox, or the quiet observation of birds in the garden, as a shameful decline from his former glory days as a world explorer. He looked at the thin layer of dust settling on his furniture and felt a pang of sadness, seeing it as a physical symbol of his own fading life and encroaching irrelevance. Arthur mused one morning, while sitting on his porch watching a tiny spider weave an intricate, translucent web across the railing, that he had been treating his retirement like a dull and endless waiting room. I was convinced that the sacred only occurred in grand cathedrals or hidden desert tombs, never in my own humble toaster. It was then that he began to intentionally practice what he called the alchemy of the ordinary. He started to realize that the dust he so detested was not actually dirt at all, it was a veil, a thin curtain obscuring a deeper reality. Hafez suggests that God is a mischievous and playful lover who deliberately hides behind the mundane aspects of life just to see if we are truly paying attention and looking for the light. The poet once wrote that even after all this time, the sun never once says to the earth, "You owe me." He invited Arthur to look at what happens with a love that is so vast and selfless, it lights up the entire sky. As Arthur sat in the morning light, he felt a sudden, powerful surge of cosmic generosity. He realized that the treasure he had spent decades trying to earn was actually the light of existence itself, a gift being offered to him for free every single morning without fail. He began to treat his simple morning tea as a sacred libation and his slow afternoon walk as a grand spiritual procession. He finally realized that the jar of his life was not empty just because he had stopped working, it was actually overflowing because he was finally still enough to see what was inside. He began to carefully wipe the dust of shoulds and musts off his tired spirit, revealing a glowing, golden contentment that had been sitting there all along, patiently waiting for him to stop being so incredibly busy. Hafez is world famous for his incredibly rich and intoxicating metaphors involving wine and the state of holy intoxication. It is important to understand that he is not talking about the liquid you find at the local liquor store. Instead, he is referring to the wine of spirit. This is a profound state of being so utterly overwhelmed and swept away by the sheer, unadulterated beauty of existence that you finally lose your sober, calculating, and constantly worrying ego. For a man like Arthur, sober had been much more than just a description, it was his entire identity and his middle name. Throughout his long career, he had been a strict accountant of hard facts and a cold measurer of heavy stone. He prided himself on his sharp, rational mind that saw the world in clear, logical dimensions. He used to think that becoming spiritual meant being perpetually solemn, serious, and perhaps even a bit grim. However, Hafez tells us a different story, suggesting that God actually loves a drunkard, not one who drinks alcohol, but someone who is completely intoxicated by the breathtaking miracle of simply being alive. I have been so incredibly sober for so long that I have practically been half dead, Arthur chuckled to himself, feeling a strange and bubbling warmth beginning to rise in his chest like a gentle tide. He realized he had been so busy measuring the exact dimensions of the world that he had completely forgotten to actually taste it. He began to intentionally practice what he called the sobriety of joy. He discovered that when he finally stopped analyzing his life like a specimen under a microscope and started truly appreciating it, he felt a lightness of spirit that he had not known since he was a 6-year-old child. He began to see that his 84 years were not a heavy burden to carry, but were instead a rare and precious vintage, slowly maturing and gaining depth in the cellar of time. Hafez once wrote that we should stay close to any soul that makes us glad to be alive. Arthur realized that the very first soul he needed to stay close to was his own. He started to laugh heartily at his own minor mistakes, began to sing loudly and badly in the shower, and even found himself raising his glass to toast the brilliance of the full moon. He felt a sudden and exhilarating sense of ecstatic freedom. He was no longer just a retired archaeologist, he was an honored guest at the great banquet of life. He realized that this wine of wisdom does not leave you with a painful hangover. Instead, it gives you a magnificent heart-over. It effectively washes away the brittle dryness of old age and replaces it with a moist, vibrant, and youthful spirit. He felt as though he was finally, for the first time in his long journey, drinking deeply from the jar he had carried with him since the day he was born. One of the most radical and life-altering aspects of Hafez's poetry is how he speaks to God not as a distant or frightening judge, but as a dear friend, a passionate lover, and even a playful partner in crime. He suggests with a mischievous wink that we are never truly alone because the beloved is woven into the very fabric of our existence, present in every breath and every heartbeat. For Arthur, who lived entirely alone in his cottage and whose social circle had gradually shrunk to just a few sporadic phone calls a week, loneliness had become a heavy shadow that lived in the quiet corners of his house. He often felt like a solitary island of one, drifting aimlessly in a vast and empty ocean of silence. But Hafez argues with beautiful conviction that this sense of being an island is nothing more than a stubborn illusion. In reality, we are not isolated pieces of land, we are the magnificent continent of God. Arthur realized one afternoon as he stared at the silent telephone on his kitchen counter that he had been sitting there waiting for the phone to ring just so he could feel some small sense of being connected to the world. But Hafez says the beloved is already sitting right there in the empty chair across from me, just waiting for me to join the party. He began to intentionally practice what he called the conversation of the heart. He started talking to this divine friend while he was pulling weeds in the garden or scrubbing the dinner dishes. It was not prayer in any formal or stiff sense, it was a deep and constant companionship. He felt a sudden, powerful surge of internal solidarity. Hafez once wrote that he wished he could show you, whenever you are lost in loneliness or darkness, the astonishing and blinding light of your own being. Arthur began to feel a deep, warm sense of self-belonging that he had never experienced during his years of global travel. He realized that the friend was not out there in some far-off temple or sacred mountain, the friend was the silent and loving witness inside his own chest. He stopped seeing his solitude as a painful state of isolation and started seeing it as a precious and sacred intimacy. He realized that he was actually the host of a magnificent internal party that simply never ended. He felt a sense of quiet, steady triumph. He was no longer a lonely old man waiting for the end of his story, he was a man in perpetual and divine company. He understood now that the jar he carried was not just holding ancient treasure, it was holding the greatest friend he would ever know. Hafez often speaks of dancing as a profound and sacred form of worship, suggesting that the entire universe is involved in a vast and rhythmic dance and that our primary job in life is to find that specific beat. For Arthur, dancing was something he had not done in any serious way since his wedding day back in 1962, a memory that felt as distant as the ancient civilizations he once studied. His current version of a dance was a slow, agonizingly careful navigation of the steep cottage stairs, which felt more like a dangerous mountain climb than a rhythmic movement. He felt deeply that his rhythm was permanently broken, his body a stiff and uncooperative instrument that no longer responded to the music of the world. But Hafez teaches us with great tenderness that the true dance is not about the strength of the legs or the flexibility of the joints, it is entirely about the act of surrender. It is about moving in harmony with life as it is, instead of wasting your precious energy fighting against the inevitable flow of time. I have been exhausting myself wrestling with my old age, Arthur mused, feeling the persistent, dull ache in his shoulders and the tightness in his back. I have been trying to push the river and stop the tide with my bare hands. He began to intentionally practice what he called the choreography of flow. He found that when he finally stopped resisting his physical limitations and started dancing with them instead, the pain began to feel less like a cold prison and more like a challenging but necessary partner. He started to move through his day with a slow, deliberate, and quiet grace, treating every single step across the kitchen floor as if it were a holy note in a divine and eternal song. Hafez once wrote that fear is the cheapest room in the whole house and that he would like to see you living in a much better place. Arthur began to feel a sudden sense of spiritual agility that he never thought possible. He realized that he could dance with great passion while sitting perfectly still in his favorite armchair. He could dance with the golden light as it moved slowly across the wooden floor, he could dance with the vivid, colorful memories of his many travels. He felt a sense of playful and defiant resilience. He was no longer a stiff, old relic to be stored away, he was a vibrant and essential participant in the cosmic ballet. He realized that the treasure in the jar was actually a song in the jar, a magnificent music that had been playing since the very beginning of time, just waiting for him to finally catch the beat and join in. Hafez holds a deep and unwavering belief that once we truly discover the magnificent treasure hidden within our own internal jar, our natural and most powerful impulse is to immediately share that light with others. He speaks beautifully of the sun, that celestial body that shines on every single person on earth without ever asking for anything in return or suggesting that any debt has been incurred. For a man like Arthur, who had become a bit stingy with his limited time and dwindling energy in his later years, this was a radical call to a new kind of expansion. In his older age, he had fallen into the trap of feeling he had to carefully conserve his remaining resources, as if his life force were a battery that was slowly but surely running out of charge. He realized with a start that this practice of hoarding his peace was actually the fastest way to lose it altogether. I have been acting like my heart is a limited resource that must be protected at all costs, Arthur chuckled quietly to himself one afternoon, as he stood at his window watching his elderly neighbor struggle to carry a heavy, bulging bag of groceries from her car. He had spent so long worrying that if he used too much kindness, he would somehow run out of it. But he decided then and there to practice what he called the radiance of the elder. He stepped outside and offered not just his strength, but a genuine word of encouragement and a witnessing ear to her stories. He found to his great surprise that when he gave of himself, his own internal gold did not decrease, instead, it seemed to multiply in a way that defied all logic. Hafez once wrote that even after all this time, the sun never once says to the earth, "You owe me," and he asked us to consider what happens with a love like that, it lights up the entire sky. Arthur felt a sudden, warm surge of generous vitality. He realized that his 84 years of hard-earned experience were not a secret to be kept, but a precious gift he was meant to pour out onto the world. He stopped being a mere consumer of comfort, sitting in his chair and waiting for the day to end, and became a vibrant distributor of light. He felt a newfound sense of communal purpose, as if he had been promoted from a retired worker to the esteemed position of grandfather of the world. He realized with a smile that the jar he carried was bottomless. The more he gave away, the more the treasure seemed to miraculously replenish itself. He finally understood that the true meaning of his long life was found in the act of pouring it out for others. In his final and most profound reflections, Arthur reached the ultimate realization of Hafez's timeless wisdom. He finally understood that the treasure, the wine, the friend, and the jar were never separate entities to be found one by one, but were instead all one and the same. They were simply different names and various masks for the same divine presence that serves as our very essence and core. He realized with a staggering sense of clarity that he did not simply have a soul as if it were a possession he could lose. Instead, he was a soul that just happened to be wearing a human body for a little while. The long and dusty archaeology of his life was finally and completely finished, not because he had found a gold mask in a desert tomb, but because he had discovered the eternal smile hidden behind his own face. "I am the jar and I am the gold," Arthur whispered softly to the bright evening stars as they began to blink in the main sky. "And the gold is God." He felt a profound and utterly indestructible peace settle over him like a warm blanket. He looked back at his 84 years of life and saw them no longer as a diminishing flame or a fading light but as a magnificent and bright summation of light. He realized that the transition we call death was not the tragic breaking of the jar but was instead the beautiful and necessary releasing of the light back into the great sun. Hafez's final message to him was not a whisper but a joyful and triumphant roar. The poet shouted through the centuries that, "Oh, you who are looking for God, the thing you are searching for is actually looking through your own eyes." Arthur felt a magnificent and resounding yes vibrate through his entire being, from his head to his tired toes. He was no longer a mortal man fearfully waiting for the end of his days, he was an eternal light having a unique 84-year experience. He was truly happy for the first time. He was home at last. And he knew with every fiber of his being that the treasure he had spent 50 years digging for in the dirt was the very witness who had been watching him dig all along. He was the lingering light, and the jar was finally and beautifully wide open for all the world to see. One quiet and cool morning, Arthur sat on his porch and observed his grandson Leo, a vibrant young man in his 20s who was clearly burning out under the weight of a high-pressure corporate job. Leo's eyes were filled with that same frantic and searching anxiety that Arthur himself had carried like a heavy backpack for so many decades. He was sitting on the wooden steps, his brow deeply furrowed and his face bathed in the cold blue light of his smartphone, staring at it as if his entire worth and identity were contained within that small glass screen. In the past, Arthur might have offered practical career advice or suggested a better way to climb the corporate ladder. But today, Arthur simply sat down quietly next to him, feeling the solid wood of the porch beneath them. He placed a warm and steady hand on Leo's tense shoulder and whispered with a playful wink reminiscent of Hafez, sparkling with a newfound and mysterious life. "Leo, you are acting exactly like a man who is dying of thirst while standing knee-deep in the middle of a vast and beautiful freshwater lake," Arthur said softly. "I need you to take a deep and honest breath and put that phone down for just one moment. That big find you are so desperately looking for, that sense of being enough and being whole, is not hidden in that digital screen or in your next promotion. It is sitting right here inside your own chest, patiently waiting for you to finally stop and notice it. You are already the undisputed king of your own universe, kid. So tell me, why are you spending your days acting like a common beggar searching for scraps of validation?" Leo looked up at his grandfather and saw a profound and golden peace in Arthur's eyes that he had never noticed before. In that single moment of pure connection, the tight tension in Leo's face began to dissolve like salt in warm water. He took a long and shaky breath, and for the first time in months, he let out a genuine and relaxed smile. Arthur felt the great ripple of Hafez's truth pass effortlessly from his own open jar to Leo's thirsty soul. He realized with a sudden thrill that his retirement was not a quiet ending but was actually his true and most powerful reign. "I am not just an old and retired man," Arthur thought as he watched the sun climb higher into the morning sky. "I am a lighthouse of the hidden treasure, standing firm against the waves." He sat back, felt the warm wine of the spirit heating his heart, and smiled at the distant birds. He was 84, he was a traveler of the internal world, and he was the luckiest man alive. The treasure in the jar was finally brilliantly and perfectly shared. My dear friends at Lingering Light, Arthur and Hafez discovered that the great expedition ends right where it began, in the sacred garden of your own heart. Hafez's treasure in the jar is a playful and profound invitation to all of us. Do not travel the world looking for the king. The king is the one who is doing the traveling. Do not dig in the dirt for gold. You are the gold. I have a question for you tonight. What dust of worry or busyness could you wipe off your jar tomorrow? What if you decided that your only job was to witness the treasure inside you for just 10 minutes? Share your golden moments in the comments. Let us celebrate our internal wealth together. Until our next gathering, wipe the jar. Taste the wine. Hug the friend. And stay in the light, the deep golden and eternally treasured light of your own soul. Good night, dear friends. Show some love by hitting like and subscribe. Also, do not forget to drop a comment. Thank you.